3. 1, 2, 3, 4, canal inglés, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Hey, hola, sí, pruebas, va. Yo creo que sabe llegar, ¿no? Ya está, vale.
Welcome to the second day of our meeting at this wonderful venue, San Pau Hospital, to continue talking about housing. Yesterday we heard interesting thoughts about what formula can we use to increase the rent housing stock. Now we are going to focus on how to increase affordable housing. I'm sure that we will learn a lot. Please remember that this forum is an initiative of the Municipal Institute for Housing and Rehabilitation, IMAP, of the Barcelona City Council. Today we will talk about the future of housing and the right to housing in the city at the time we are overcoming a pandemic. How are we going to do this? In this session we will have the Mentimeter, this website tool that allows us to understand and to follow up, to do a follow-up, whether you are here or connected online. You need to go to menti.com and then you will have to key in a code 78939 and there you can send your questions and comments that we will pass on to the speakers. Again, it is very important to silence your phones. We will start this session today with Julie Lawson. She is connected online and she is a professor, honorary associate professor for housing studies at the Urban Research Center at the RMIT University in Australia. Hello, Julie.
Hello, everybody. So good to be here. Okay, welcome.
You may speak. I think you have the floor, Julie.
Okay, great. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you so much for being patient and waiting while storm obviously was blowing over Barcelona, and I hope everybody is doing okay. And I'd just like to say a warm hello from Australia, which is where I am at this moment. I'm going to talk about a very interesting and important study that was completed very recently and launched at the UNEC in Geneva in October the 6th. I was working on this study for almost 2 years, certainly not alone, and involved with a very wonderful team, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. In particular, my co-authors, Professor Michelle Norris from Dublin, and also Professor Holger Wahlbaum from Gothenburg, from Chalmers University there. But alongside that, a wonderful writers team, scribes, if you like, who were the scribes of the report. I want to tell you about who was involved and who supported this, because it does come out of a strong heritage in the sense of a partnership of, if you like, a coalition of the willing between Housing Europe and UN Habitat and UNEC, a joint initiative which is very special because you've got intergovernmental organisations and also a hands-on industry body working together for the first time, which is quite amazing, I think. Also, I want to bring across a message of hope in a way, because the study is very much about can do. It's about trying to do things differently than have been done in the recent decades, and to have a more, if you like, positive and hands-on approach to shaping more effective housing systems and shaping them for the benefit of people and the planet. So to do so, we realise that, of course, housing sits within a housing system. It sits within a land system, a finance system. It involves institutions that govern it, that shape it, and also it has an impact on the environment. So we have 4 topics that we work together on over a period of almost 2 years. The first one is about housing governance and regulation. The second one is about access to finance and funding. And the third one about access and availability of land for affordable housing. And the fourth one about all the different kinds of tools we can use to generate and renovate and reuse housing for more climate neutral and sustainable purposes. The study is big, and it covered 56 countries, which were surveyed through their national focal points. Often also local were involved. It had a focal point survey as well as an online survey, which anyone could also contribute towards. Involved a very extensive review of international research evidence, again with a large team. I mentioned 3 of them, but in fact there was a much broader team behind it of 6 academics. We had a number of workshops, for example, 8 thematic workshops and regional workshops focusing on the 4 topics I mentioned, but also in different regions of Europe. For example, the Mediterranean, the CIS states, and Western Europe. And in that process, we also did a lot of communication efforts, developed a series of podcasts, each with very exciting interviews, which are well worth a listen. And in the process, we were able to abstract 30 interesting tools that could be used to be more effective in shaping better markets for affordable housing, to shape markets to be more attuned with the priorities of affordable and social housing and climate neutral housing, and also to show how they've been applied in more than 70 different contexts. The report comes out of a long heritage, beginning with the Sustainable Development Goals, also responding to the impact of the pandemic and the advice of UN Habitat to countries on dealing with that. It's embedded and emerging from the Geneva UN Charter on Sustainable Housing, and it informs also an action plan. The report Housing 2030, as I mentioned, was launched at a ministerial meeting of 56 countries at the UNEC in Geneva on the 6th of October, alongside an action plan which was endorsed by countries there. And the action plan is, in fact, largely derived from the recommendations of Housing 2030. So this is just to give you a flavour of the many people who were involved. You might recognise some of the faces, because in this report, and I can show you a live copy here, which is quite a big report, Barcelona is actually mentioned 26 times. There's a good deal of attention is given to also local leadership and the importance of strong, effective, strategic, professional, adequately resourced leadership as well. As I mentioned, we had many, many events and involved ultimately almost 1,200 participants, and in either being a member of the audience of those web events or in presenting and discussing, or as interviews on podcasts and in submitting also to surveys and so on. So this just gives you a little flavour of who was involved. As I mentioned, it's very much about tools. Obviously, we don't consider that you have one tool in your toolkit, but the way we work together to work on a housing system, to be able to shape that working of a housing system to be the benefit for people and the planet. So when we talk about tools, what we're not advising is that they can be used in the same way in every place. They're not universal tools. There's things that have to be responsive to the drivers of unaffordable or inaccessible housing in each place. So they have to be culturally relevant to reflect the needs and aspirations of people in local communities. So these are not, if you like, blueprints, but they're tools to be adapted to the situation, to be customised, to be appropriate, to be relevant. So we talk about governance tools, finance and investment tools, land policy tools, and climate neutrality tools. With regards to governance, what were we talking about there? Well, of course, every form of governance needs to have a strategic framework. It needs to know where it's going. It can be a global framework, it can be a national framework, it can be a local framework, for example, in Barcelona's right to the city. But of course, once having that framework, leadership and commitment to it, political commitment at the highest possible level, also reaching out to local communities, working together in partnership, the commitment also in resources, in legislation that backs it, giving the authority and the power and the resources to shape better markets. But of course, just like EMAB is being created, you need expertise that is concentrated and empowered and resourced to be able to make a difference. In the report, we give examples of different types of those market-shaping institutions and how they were established and resourced and given the ability to implement and make a difference. And also, of course, their staff, their skilled staff, how capable they are and how well trained, certified, whether they're equipped to do the job they need to do. We also talk about the importance of multi-level governance and partnership. One of the things that is very strong, for example, in the Barcelona Right to Housing Plan and EMAB is the importance of coordination and bringing what was fragmented agencies together to be able to work together towards a coherent set of strategic goals. So often the resources might be in one level of government, but the actual need and implementation is at another level. So having long-term resource agreements, we give some examples of how those agreements are so important over time. Governing with insight, we give different ways that affordability can be managed, can be measured, and the pros and cons of each. There's nothing more powerful than having also housing standards that are not only set but monitored and enforced. You know well, of course, the impact of trying to manage the scourge sometimes of short-term letting affecting long-term housing, and having standards, being able to monitor them adequately and enforce is very, very important. But it also helps to have housing providers working for the common good, if you like, a coalition partner of the willing. So having mission-focused, for example, cooperatives or not-for-profit housing providers to be an important force, a standard-setting, rights reinforcing role player, if you like, exemplar of what good practice is. It's very important that you have providers for the common good that are also able to flourish in often what is typically a fairly market-based system. Let's not forget, finally, also the role of households themselves in governing their own homes. And there are many models which we give in the report of those. I know we haven't got much time, so I'm going to have to move rather quickly for the rest of the slides. But in the finance and funding chapter, each has a dedicated chapter. We spend a lot of time looking at regulations that shape the flow and pace and direction of investment into the housing and real estate sector, and the importance of having much more assertive control over that flow of investment, where it goes, how much, who gets it, than we have in recent years. We need to learn from what's happening now, also with the financialisation of housing and the impact on affordability during COVID and the excessive rising house prices, etc. So moderating the flow of credit has become ever more important. And also the role of different types of investors, public investors who have a steering role in where capital investment is going, also in terms of operating subsidies and mediating the feasibility of particular housing models. We go further in this chapter to talk about a whole range of different models, not-for-profit business models and the use of revolving surpluses, tax provisions, also favouring ideal forms of investment and discouraging others, for example. Another important chapter is on land policy. The kind of tools that are illustrated there include the very important public land banking and purposeful development role of cities, in particular of cities. We give examples of good practice from Vienna, from Paris, and from many other countries. But we also take a look at the importance of land leasing and how that can be used to steer conditional or purposeful use. We look at different ways in which fragmented and underutilised or dilapidated sites can be brought back to life through purposeful land readjustment, guiding more effective redevelopment. But we also look at other private sector tools, for example, land value recapture and reinvesting with a purpose, and how that can be a very cost-effective mechanism for some cities which have few resources themselves. Using planning instruments like inclusionary zoning, development contributions, requirements, and zoning for particular segments of the housing market. We give examples of how that can be designed and has been implemented in different countries. But important, apart from all these land policy instruments, is also agreements between developers, investors, and the planners themselves in bringing together all the stakeholders and ensuring that appropriate outcomes are achieved at a neighbourhood level. Finally, what kind of tools are outlined in the climate neutral section? Well, again, we're talking about national strategies and having a vision, having agreements, working with the stakeholders. And we give examples of how countries have tried to do that. For example, in the Netherlands, in actually defossilizing heating systems in homes and the national strategy for doing that. Or in Estonia, how they've made a clear, purposeful strategy to be able to improve the quality of homes that are now in severe dilapidation, that were built in the Soviet era and actually neglected and under maintained. So we talk not just about investments, but also spatial planning and mobility planning, about the 15-minute city, about how to promote more walkable cities and neighbourhoods, about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. We've heard a lot about that at COP26. It's very much an interest also of Housing 2030. We dedicate some time to that. And also how we buy things, what procurement conditions, norms, incentives and support, so that we do support a greener, perhaps circular economy as well. Not to forget regulation, standardisation, building construction standards, having a strategy for the building construction industry to improve its practices and use of materials and reuse. And we look at it a lot of non-regulatory and also capacity building and professional training tools and awareness raising amongst households as well, as keeping in mind that many of the greatest savings that can be made in energy efficiency are actually just by changing our own behaviour, closing the window, turning off the lights, not recharging apparatus endlessly. So actually awareness raising amongst households is also important. One of the key foci of this particular section was about the affordability of renovation and the potential for not only reducing costs for households, but the danger of renovation costs leaking into rent costs and thereby making homes unaffordable, and also potentially, even with deep renovation, leading to renoviction and tenants not being able to come back. So a key theme of Housing 2030 is how to do climate neutral housing in an affordable and inclusive way. And there are going to be times when assistance is required to tenants who may not be able to afford increased rents to achieve long-term maintenance planning to ensure that there are no bumpy increases in costs, to require landlords to put aside adequate funds for maintenance and improvements over time so it spreads those costs, and to prevent them from passing on these short-term costs immediately onto low-income tenants. Housing 2030 produced a number of products, if you like, or communication vehicles. One of them, of course, is that report that I mentioned, which is out now. You can download that for free. It's in Russian. The summary is in French and English. We'd have to lobby hard for UDC to in the future to translate it into Catalan, but at the moment it's in English. There are podcasts which are also a joy to listen to. There are 12 of those, each with several voices. And then, of course, there's the online database of many of the good practices, the videos, the PowerPoint presentations, the publications, and the podcasts can all be found there. So what were the key messages of Housing 2030? I think important was the need to have an attitude to housing policy which was one which was more confident, more rather than picking up the pieces or mopping up the mess of crises. It should be there shaping better housing systems. One that which see that housing is central to people's lives. It's a basic need. It should be, that role should be elevated. Its role in giving a quality to human life and also sustainable communities, that should be elevated. We should be more concerned about the right to adequate housing and how to realise it. It's all very well to claim housing as a right, but realising that right is the hard work, and that's the work that the tools where Housing 2030 comes to play. We also argue right from the beginning that our reliance on purely free market mechanisms has actually been quite disastrous in terms of access to affordable housing, and therefore we need to take back the reins and be much more active in shaping the better delivery of homes that we need. And this requires very well-informed, purposeful policy, mission-focused and expert agencies. And these are several of these qualities to be found in Barcelona. It's really exciting to see what you're doing and what leadership you're actually providing the rest of Europe. It's wonderful. So Housing 2030 features Barcelona numerous times. As I mentioned, it gives 30 tools and more than 70 illustrations for adaptation, not for cookie-cutter application. It's for adaptation and customisation to be relevant to the setting. And this requires not only leadership, as has been shown from local government, but also the backing of national governments. This is, in some cases, often sorely lacking, and also exchange and collaboration with the international community, which I think even through COVID-19 we've found the rapid exchange of good ideas and best practices to be ever more important. And I'd also like to draw your attention finally to that regional action plan, which has been endorsed by UNICE countries for implementation into 2030. And you'll find in there some very interesting and quite progressive commitments. So thank you for listening. And I'd like to also once again remind you of the importance of collaboration and working with a coalition of the willing. And I think Housing 20 to some degree is an example of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We have questions, I think.
Perhaps there's some questions or...
Yes, yes. And
No.
Yes. Can you read? La pregunta és quins reptes comuns entre ciutats globals com Barcelona.
The question is, what are the common challenges among global cities like Barcelona you have identified? What are the challenges of different cities? What do they have in common?
Oh, well, I think one of the biggest one at the moment is the massive flow of finance. I mean, despite what we've seen, that household resources are being undercut by very high housing costs. So when unaffordable housing becomes so pervasive, what you see is a whole lot of knock-on effects. Knock-on effects for example, delayed family formation or delayed leaving of the parental home. You see things like intergenerational or just general inequality evolving between, if you like, the outsiders and the insiders of housing markets that are accelerating in house prices, while others are unable to join the party, so to speak. I mean, a lack of inequality, of course, is the opposite of that is social solidarity. And we do see that this runaway house prices also undermining social solidarity to some degree, with some households really feeling left out. You see a lack of affordable housing also having implications for access to work, access to reasonable journeys to work. For example, people having to do long commutes to be able to access their work, often located in city centres. This also can lead them to being in areas of lower amenity or less quality housing, far from amenity and services, and that again accelerates inequality. Furthermore, of course, if people are spending so much on their housing costs, and they're also not spending on other more productive forms of economic investment. So despite the big hurrah for the growth of mortgage markets and access to home ownership, for example, and that was pushed from the 1990s, we've actually seen a decline in home ownership in countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and even Greece, for example. And we know young households are really finding it hard to leave the parental home, they rent for longer periods, they're less likely to purchase a home. But in the social sector, we see that there's declining capital investment in that, unlike some cities where it's been reversed, like in Barcelona. And what we need is much more balanced set of incentives for the flow of investment towards purposeful, affordable and social housing, and away from, if you like, speculative house trading, which has really undermined and the root of many problems. So yes, I mean, that is definitely a common theme, that despite COVID, despite people losing their incomes, we saw runaway house prices and overinvestment in real estate occurring all over Europe. It's incredible. Still is.
Tenim una segona pregunta, que seria la...
We have a second question for you. It's the final one, because
i que ens la passaran ara mateix.
We will have it in a second on the screen.
Quines eines concretes plantegen a l'informe
What are
per
the
treball
specific
conjunt
tools
amb actors de la
the
comunitat
report
local,
proposes
o sigui,
to work
promotors,
jointly
entitats socials
with the local
i
stakeholders?
plataformes
I mean,
ciutadanes.
developers, social institutions, citizens' platforms, groups of citizens, charities, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really pertinent, good question. We spend quite a bit in the report. There's a chapter on governance, for example, which talks about multi-level governance and multi-level agreements and arrangements. It gives some examples of also at the local level of estate management, at the regional level of agreements, as in Finland, the MAL agreements, where at the most area-based plans are worked out where they try to address local needs which cover different segments of the housing market, and together with developers, with municipal housing companies, and with the local municipality itself, but that those costs are, if you like, facilitated and made more feasible by direct investment and also agreements over land use or land lease and also planning permission. So a range of tools come together to work at the local level. But you also see other things happening in Estonia, for example, cooperative apartment associations. So having to form an association to work out how you would like to manage and maintain a complex of individuals. You see that being really turned around in some of the former Soviet states. Estonia is a leading example. But you also see very well-established forms of participation and self-determination, like tenant democracy in Denmark. And we talk about how that's actually institutionalized and gives control, but also in terms of the long-term financing, repair, maintenance and expansion of their housing, how by paying their rents over time, when the financing costs have been repaid, if you like, the money then is into a pool. That pool is able to be reinvested in good deep renovation when required and expansion of new housing. So that's a sort of form of solidarity between smaller states and the whole housing needs of the whole country. You see that what's happening now there in that revolving fund is in a time of need, a decision has been made to invest in extensive energy efficiency measures and building work, and they've been able to use that pot of money for purposeful and timely counter-cyclical reasons. But there are many forms of organisation and negotiating power that have been also embedded in this report. For example, the tenant-landlord agreements, which are institutionalised by the Swedish Tenants Union, the role of the German Tenants Union itself as a membership-based insurance scheme for tenants to help them in times of conflict and need, to help resolve things. I mean, there are so many forms of also citizen juries. You've had a presentation already on Vienna, the way in which developer competitions are conducted. But I understand in Barcelona that's also something that's going on, where and that can involve a degree of citizen engagement, participation and control. In the governance section, we also talk about how people can manage their own homes better in terms of cooperative living and how that's can be managed. So there's a few examples of all different types. I know there are more, but I'm happy to... I would say please dive in and enjoy this reports, and I hope you find it really inspiring and useful, and that it can be updated. It will be each year. The 56 countries have to report on that action plan each year at the ministerial meetings. So when countries come together and they suggest, try to show and tell what they're doing, they now have to respond to the actions in the action plan. And many of them include multi-level governance, engagement, tenant empowerment, and supporting cooperative ways of living. So,
thank you, Julie. Moltes gràcies per aquest missatge d'esperança que ha
Thank you
començat
very
dient
much,
que
Julie,
ens
for
donava,
this message of hope, for doing the things different, for trying to find an answer to this lack of affordable housing, which is the axis, I guess, of the thesis. And thank you for having told us that we actually need examples, or like conferences like this one, best practices applied to housing as a common good. So thank you indeed very much, Julie.